Today, we're going to discuss Iran's biggest strategic victory against Israel in the entire war. And most Israelis and most Americans still don't even realize it happened. So let's talk about what Iran did to set up their greatest victory. In order to understand this, we need to go back to the beginning of the war. When Hamas launched their attack into Israel, one of their goals was to capture Israeli soldiers to use as human shields. For the most part, the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, did a good job at preventing that from happening. They encircled Sderot, and they have really tight control over the Gaza border. That meant that Hamas was unable to bring in any reinforcements or launch many attacks from inside Israel. However, there was one place where Hamas did manage to get some of their forces into Israel undetected, and that was through the underground tunnels. Now, we've talked about these tunnels before. We've discussed how Israel is working hard to destroy them, and how difficult it is for Israel to do so because these tunnels are underground. It's not like Israel can just drop bombs from above to destroy them. These tunnels run deep underneath the ground. It's hard for Israel to target them with artillery fire, and the way that Israel has been destroying them is by getting in there with infantry and destroying them from within, which is slow and dangerous work. But while Israel was focused on fighting Hamas directly, Iran was launching missile after missile into Israel. Those missiles were not only designed to inflict damage and casualties upon Israel, but also to force Israel to divert resources away from the tunnels and towards defending against those ballistic missiles. But there was another purpose behind those Iranian missiles, and that was to force Israel to respond to those missiles. If Israel didn't respond to those missiles, then Iran would accuse Israel of being weak, and they would say that shows that the Zionist entity isn't strong enough to defend itself, and it would be very bad for the prestige of the Iranian regime. Now, Iran didn't want Israel to respond in the West Bank. That would only play into Iran's narrative that Israel is committing atrocities against Palestinians in the West Bank. Instead, Iran wanted Israel to respond to those missiles launched from Lebanon and Syria. The theory was that if Israel had to respond to rockets fired from Lebanon and Syria, then that would force the hand of Hezbollah, which would then lead to the eruption of a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And that's exactly what happened. The war between Israel and Hamas expanded into a full-blown war in the north with Hezbollah. So, again, from Iran's perspective, mission accomplished. They forced Israel to fight a two-front war, but Iran wasn't done yet. As soon as Israel started focusing its attention on the northern border with Lebanon, Iran sent more missiles into Israel. This time, however, the missiles weren't launched from Lebanon or Syria. These missiles were launched from Gaza, and these missiles caused massive damage and hundreds of deaths. Many Israelis had to flee their homes and leave the country. All the while, Israel was already spread thin, fighting Hezbollah in the north. After those attacks, Israel responded by launching airstrikes all over Gaza. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Just as the October War began, Israel released over 2,400 Palestinian prisoners from prison. Many of those prisoners had direct ties to Hamas, if not direct members of Hamas, and so they were able to go back to Gaza and immediately start planning attacks, because, remember, Hamas doesn't need to launch the attacks themselves. They just need to inspire people to carry out attacks on their own. When the news broke that Israel had released 2,400 prisoners, many of those prisoners who returned to Gaza wasted no time at all. Within hours, one of those released prisoners was already directing an attack on an Israeli bus. The fact that Israel released these prisoners seemed to give a green light to anyone with even the slightest ties to Hamas, that they too could carry out attacks against Israel and get away with it. Now, I should clarify that I'm not saying Israel made a mistake releasing those prisoners. There's always a cost to war, and one of the costs of war is sometimes having to release prisoners. But again, it's important to understand the context here. At this time, Israel was being attacked on two fronts. They were trying to hold the line in the south against Hamas, and they were also fighting Hezbollah in the north. And during this time, they were also dealing with the aftermath of the October 7th attack. Thousands of Israelis were dead. Hundreds more were missing. Their infrastructure was crumbling. People were fleeing their homes. Hospitals were overwhelmed. They were under constant missile attacks. And amidst all that chaos, they had to deal with the threat of these newly released prisoners carrying out attacks inside Israel. This is why Iran's strategy has been so effective. All they needed to do was to create a few problems for Israel, a few headaches for Israel, and Israel would take care of the rest. Israel would take the bait, and Israel did. Even though Israel was successful in destroying the tunnels, even though Israel is inflicting massive casualties on Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel still took the bait. And when Israel took the bait, Iran scored their greatest strategic victory of the war. And that was the transfer of thousands of troops from the Gaza border to the Lebanon border. Before the October War, many analysts estimated that around 40,000 Israeli troops were stationed along the Gaza border, with many more ready to quickly deploy there if needed. But since the outbreak of fighting with Hezbollah, many of those troops have had to be diverted north to the Lebanon border. This has left the Gaza border relatively undefended, which has allowed Hamas to push further into Israeli territory than they ever have before. In fact, Hamas now controls more land than the state of New Hampshire. Now, I'm sure some people watching this will say, well, that's just a temporary setback. Israel will push Hamas back eventually. But the question is, how much time does Israel have? How long can this stalemate continue before it starts to become a permanent situation? And this is why Iran's strategy has been so brilliant. They've been able to force Israel to divert tens of thousands of troops away from the Gaza border. Think about it. What if I told you that right now, as we speak, there are tens of thousands of Hamas fighters, with bulldozers and explosives and RPGs and anti-tank missiles, sitting right across the border from you in your home? You would be terrified. You would feel completely vulnerable, and that's the position that Israel finds itself in right now. And this is also why Israel needs a ceasefire. Not necessarily with Hamas or Hezbollah, but with whoever is willing to give it to them. Even if Israel could crush Hamas and Hezbollah, the other side of that equation is that Hamas and Hezbollah have shown that they are willing to sacrifice hundreds of lives for every single life that they lose. Eventually, that means that Israel will suffer unacceptable levels of casualties. Casualties that will tear their society apart. Casualties that could lead to protests on the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, which brings us to the current situation. Israel has been unable to achieve any significant victories against Hamas or Hezbollah, and at the same time, the world is pressuring Israel to accept a ceasefire. And if Israel accepts that ceasefire, then Iran will score a massive propaganda victory, and Hamas and Hezbollah will be emboldened to carry on the fight against Israel. So, this is the situation that Israel finds itself in right now, and if things continue like this, then Iran is going to be the big winner in this war. This is why I say that Israel is on the verge of making a major blunder. They're essentially dancing to the tune of Iran. Now, I'm not saying that Israel is going to lose the war. I'm not saying that Hamas and Hezbollah are going to overrun Israel, or that Israel won't prevail in the end. But what I am saying is that Israel is on the verge of making a major strategic blunder that could cost them dearly. If you want to better understand global politics, follow along for more.